Chapter 23 of the Stillwater Tragedy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Stillwater Tragedy by Thomas Bailey Aldrich. Chapter 23. When the Down Express arrived at Stillwater that night, two passengers stepped from the rear car to the platform. One was Richard Shackford, and the other a commercial traveler, whose acquaintance Richard had made the previous evening on the Fall River boat. There were no hacks in waiting at the station, and Richard found his politeness put to a severe test when he saw himself obliged to pilot his companion part of the way to the hotel, which lay, it seemed almost maliciously, in a section of town remote from the Slocums. Curbing his impatience, Richard led the stranger through several crooked, unlighted streets, and finally left him at the corner of the main thoroughfare, within pistol shot of the red glass lantern which hung over the door of the tavern. This cost Richard 10 good minutes. As he hurriedly turned into a cross street on the left, he fancied that he heard his name called several times from somewhere in the darkness. A man came running towards him. It was Mr. Peters.
"Can I say a word to you, Mr. Shackford?"
"If it isn't a long one, I am rather pressed."
"It is about Torrini, sir."
"What of him?"
"He's mighty bad, sir."
"Oh, I can't stop to hear that," and Richard quickened his pace.
"The doctor took off his hand last Wednesday," said Peters, keeping alongside, "and he's been getting worse and worse."
Richard halted. "Took off his hand?"
"Didn't you know he was caught in the rolling machine at Dana's? Well, it was after you went away."
"This is the first I've heard of it."
"It was hard lines for him, sir, with the woman and the 2 children, and nothing to eat in the house. The boys in the yard have done what they could, but with the things from the drugstore and so on, we couldn't hold up our end. Mr. Dana paid the doctor's bill, but if it hadn't been for Miss Slocum, I don't know what would have happened. I thought maybe if I spoke to you and told you how it was—"
"Did Torrini send you?"
"Lord, no. He's too proud to send anybody. He's been so proud since they took off his hand that there has been no doing anything with him. If they was to take off his leg, he would turn to one mass of pride. No, Mr. Shackford, I came of myself."
"Where does Torrini live now?"
"In Mitchell's Alley."
"I will go along with you," said Richard, with a dogged air. It seemed as if the fates were determined to keep him from seeing Margaret that night. Peters reached out a hand to take Richard's leather bag. "No, thank you, I can carry it very well." In a small morocco case in one of the pockets was a heavy plain gold ring for Margaret, and not for anything in the world would Richard have allowed anyone else to carry the bag. After a brisk 5 minutes' walk, the two emerged upon a broad street crossing their path at right angles. All the shops were closed except Stubbs, the provision dealer's, and Dundon's drugstore. In the window of the apothecary a great purple jar, with a spray of gas jets behind it, was flaring on the darkness like a Bengal light. Richard stopped at the provision store and made some purchases. A little further on he halted at a fruit stand kept by an old crone who had supplemented the feeble flicker of the corner street lamp with a pitch pine torch, which cast a yellow bloom over her apples and turned them all into oranges. She had real oranges, however, and Richard selected half a dozen, with a confused idea of providing the little Italians with some national fruit, though both children had been born in Stillwater. Then the pair resumed their way, Peters acting as pioneer. They soon passed beyond the region of sidewalks and curbstones, and began picking their steps through a narrow, humid lane, where the water lay in slimy pools, and the tenement houses on each side blotted out the faint starlight. The night was sultry, and door and casement stood wide, making pits of darkness. Few lights were visible, but a continuous hum of voices issued from the human hives, and now and then a transient red glow at an upper window showed that someone was smoking a pipe. This was Mitchell's Alley. The shadows closed behind the two men as they moved forward, and neither was aware of the figure which had been discreetly following them for the last 10 minutes. If Richard had suddenly wheeled and gone back a dozen paces, he would have come face to face with the commercial traveler. Mr. Peters paused in front of one of the tenement houses and motioned with his thumb over his shoulder for Richard to follow him through a yawning doorway. The hall was as dark as a cave, and full of stale, moldy odors. Peters shuffled cautiously along the bare boards until he kicked his toe against the first step of the staircase.
"Keep close to the wall, Mr. Shackford, and feel your way up. They've used the banisters for kindling, and the landlord says he shan't put in any more. I went over here the other night,"
added Mr. Peters reminiscentially. After fumbling several seconds for the latch, Mr. Peters pushed open a door and ushered Richard into a large, gloomy rear room. A kerosene lamp was burning dimly on the mantel-shelf, over which hung a coarsely colored lithograph of the Virgin in a pine frame. Under the picture stood a small black crucifix. There was little furniture: a cooking stove, 2 or 3 stools, a broken table, and a chest of drawers. On an iron bedstead in the corner lay Torrini, muffled to the chin in a blanket, despite the hot midsummer night. His right arm, as if it were wholly disconnected with his body, rested in a splint on the outside of the covering. As the visitors entered, a tall, dusky woman with blurred eyes rose from a low bench at the foot of the bed.
"Is he awake?"
asked Peters. The woman, comprehending the glance which accompanied the words, though not the words themselves, nodded yes.
"Here is Mr. Shackford come to see you, Torrini," Peters said.
The man slowly unclosed his eyes. They were unnaturally brilliant and dilated, and seemed to absorb the rest of his features.
"I didn't want him."
"Let bygones be bygones, Torrini," said Richard, approaching the bedside. "I am sorry about this."
"You're very good. I don't understand. I ask nothing of Slocum, but the signorina comes every day, and I cannot help it. What would you have? I am a dead man."
And he turned away his face. "It is not so bad as that," said Richard. Torrini looked up with a ghastly smile.
"They have cut off the hand that struck you, Mr. Shackford."
"I suppose it was necessary. I am very sorry. In a little while you will be on your feet again."
"It is too late. They might have saved me by taking the arm, but I would not allow them. I may last 3 or 4 days. The doctor says it."
Peters, standing in the shadow, jerked his head affirmatively.
"I do not care for myself," the man continued, "but she and the little ones, that is what maddens me. They will starve."
"They will not be let to starve in Stillwater," said Richard. Torrini turned his eyes upon him wistfully and doubtfully.
"You will help them?"
"Yes, I and others."
"If they could be got to Italy," said Torrini, after meditating, "it would be well. Her father," giving a side look at the woman, "is a fisherman of Capri."
At the word Capri, the woman lifted her head quickly.
"He is not rich, but he is not poor. He would take her."
"You would wish her sent to Naples?"
"Yes."
"If you do not pull through, she and the children shall go there."
"Brigida,"
said Torrini. Then he said something rapidly in Italian to the woman, who buried her face in both hands and did not reply.
"She has no words to thank you. See, she is tired to death, with the children all day and me all night, these many nights."
"Tell her to go to bed in the other room," said Richard. "There's another room, isn't there? I'll sit with you."
"You?"
"Your wife is fagged out, that is plain. Send her to bed, and don't talk any more. Peters, I wish you'd run and get a piece of ice somewhere. There's no drinking water here. Come now, Torrini. I can't speak Italian." "Oh, I don't mind your scowling. I intend to stay." Torrini slowly unknitted his brows, and an irresolute expression stole across his face. Then he called Brigida, and bade her to go in with the children. She bowed her head submissively, and fixing her melting eyes on Richard for an instant, passed into the adjoining chamber. Peters shortly reappeared with the ice, and after setting a jug of water on the table, departed. Richard turned up the wick of the kerosene lamp, which was sending forth a disagreeable odor, and pinned an old newspaper around the chimney to screen the flame. He had, by an odd chance, made his lampshade out of a copy of the Stillwater Gazette, containing the announcement of his cousin's death. Richard gave a quick start as his eyes caught the illuminated headlines. Mysterious murder of Lemuel Shackford. Perhaps a slight exclamation escaped Richard's lips at the same time, for Torrini turned and asked what was the matter. "Nothing at all," said Richard, removing the paper and placing another in its stead. Then he threw open the blinds of the window, looking on the back yard, and set his handbag against the door to prevent it being blown to by the draught. Torrini, without altering the rigid position of his head on the pillow, followed every movement with a look of curious insistence, like that of the eyes in a portrait. His preparations completed for the night, Richard seated himself on a stool at the foot of the bed. The obscurity and stillness of the room had their effect upon the sick man, who presently dropped into a light sleep. Richard sat thinking of Margaret, and began to be troubled because he had neglected to send her word of his detention, which he might have done by Peters. It was now too late. The town clock struck 10 in the midst of his self-reproaches. At the first clang of the bell, Torrini awoke with a start and asked for water.
"If anybody comes,"
he said, glancing in a bewildered, anxious way at the shadows huddled about the door,
"you're not to leave me alone with him."
"Him? Whom? Are you expecting anyone?"
"No. But who knows? One might come. Then you are not to go. You are not to leave me for a second."
"I've no thought of it," replied Richard. "You may rest easy." "He's a trifle light in the head," was Richard's reflection. After that, Torrini dozed rather than slumbered. rousing at brief intervals, and whenever he awoke the feverish activity of his brain incited him to talk, now of Italy, and now of matters connected with his experiences in this country. "Naples is a pleasant place," he broke out in the hush of the midnight, just as Richard was dropping off. "The band plays every afternoon on the Chiaia, and then the festas. Every third day a festa. The devil was in my body when I left there, and dragged little Brigida into all this misery. We used to walk of an evening along the Marinella. That's a strip of beach beyond the Mola Piccola. You were never in Naples?" "Not I," said Richard. "Here, wet your lips, and try to go to sleep again." "No, I can't sleep for thinking. When the Signorina came to see me the other day, her heart was pierced with pity, like the blessed Madonna's. Her bosom bleeds for all. You will let her come tomorrow?" "Yes, yes. If you only keep quiet, Margaret shall come." "Margherita, we say. You are to wed her. Is it not so?" Richard turned down the wick of the lamp, which was blazing and spluttering, and did not answer. Then Torrini lay silent for a long while, apparently listening to the hum of the telegraph wires attached to one end of the roof. At odd intervals the freshening breeze swept these wires and awoke a low Aeolian murmur. The moon rose in the meantime, and painted on the uncarpeted floor the shape of the cherry bough that stretched across the window. It was 2:00. Richard sat with his head bent forward in a drowse. "Now the cousin is dead, you are as rich as a prince, are you not?" inquired Torrini, who had laid for the last half hour with his eyes wide open in the moonlight. Richard straightened himself with a jerk. "Torrini, I positively forbid you to talk any more. I remember you said one day, somewhere, where was it? In the yard. You can't be allowed to speak here, you know. And then I struck at you, with that hand they've taken away. See how I remember it." "Why do you bother your mind with such things? Think of just nothing at all, and rest. Perhaps a wet cloth on your forehead will refresh you. I wish you had a little of my genius for not keeping awake." "You are tired, you?" "I have had 2 broken nights traveling." "And I give you no peace?" "Well, no," returned Richard bluntly, hoping the admission would induce Torrini to tranquilize himself. "You don't give me much." "Has anyone been here?" demanded Torrini abruptly. "Not a soul. Good heaven, man, do you know what time it is?" I know, it's very late. I ought to keep quiet. But the devil with this fever in my brain, Mr. Shackford." And Torrini, in spite of his imprisoned limb, suddenly half raised himself from the mattress. I... Richard sprung to his feet. "What is it? What do you want?" "Nothing," said Torrini, falling back on the pillow. Richard brought him a glass of water, which he refused. He lay motionless, with his eyes shut, as if composing himself, and Richard returned on tiptoe to his bench. A moment or two afterwards, Torrini stirred the blanket with his foot. "Mr. Shackford." "Well?" "I am as grateful as a dog." Torrini did not speak again. This expression of his gratitude appeared to ease him. His respiration grew lighter and more regular, and by he fell into a profound sleep. Richard watched a while expectantly, with his head resting against the rail of the bedstead. Then his eyelids drooped, and he too slumbered. But once or twice, before he quite lost himself, he was conscious of Brigida's thin face thrust like a silver wedge through the half-open door of the hall bedroom. It was the last thing he remembered, that sharp, pale face peering out from the blackness of the inner chamber, as his grasp loosened on the world, and he drifted off on the tide of a dream. A narrow white hand like a child's seemed to be laid against his breast. It was not Margaret's hand, and yet it was hers. No, it was the plaster model he had made that idle summer afternoon, years and years before he had ever thought of loving her. Strange for it to be there. Then Richard began wondering how the gold ring would look on the slender forefinger. He unfastened the leather bag and took out the ring. He was vainly trying to pass it over the first joint of the dead white finger, when the cast slipped from his hold and fell with a crash to the floor. Richard gave a shudder and opened his eyes. Brigida was noiselessly approaching Torrini's bedside. Torrini still slept. It was broad day. Through the uncurtained window Richard saw the blue sky barred with crimson. End of chapter 23.